This segment is some recommendations for me of how to become more prominent. So this is essentially a mentoring segment. There are certain things that over the years I've recommended to my clients, and if they have enough time, they can use these tips, and they can move forward, and they can become more prominent in their field. One of the things that I say, some people might say, you should always say yes to opportunity, because opportunity is something that can get you out in front of the public or employers. What I say is often say yes to opportunity, and what you have to think about is, what are you going to get out of a project versus how much it will cost you in regard to your time. So for example, if someone says, I want you to design this project, and you realize it's going to take 500 hours of your time, and nothing really is going to come of it, then it might not be something that you should say yes to. So one of the things you have to think about is how much time is going to be involved, and how is it going to help you if you're trying to get this visa? How is it going to be helpful to you? Another tip: cultivate opportunities to be quoted. This is really essential. So no one is necessarily looking for you to give a quote. They're going to look for a quote for whoever's around, if there's some sort of like media opportunity. However, if you look for those opportunities to be quoted, then all of a sudden you can kind of leapfrog to the front of this O1 visa category. Like if you have, like I had a client who was a curator, and she didn't really have any published material, like she didn't have any press about herself, and I said, you really have to look for media opportunities, and she was able to get a quote in the Wall Street Journal, which is a big publication, and she said something like, I think the art prices are going to go up. I mean, it was as simple as that, but that was published material about her because it was in a major media. It really helped her visa application. Another tip would be to try to get the contact information of any journalist that you meet. So if you run into a journalist, always look for their email so that you can cultivate that group. And so if you have something that you've done or that you're going to do, and you have a press release, you can get that out to the journalist. And if the journalist knows you, they're more likely to be interested in covering that idea. Another idea would be to keep a journal of ideas. I mean, this seems like a very simple thing, but if you don't write it down, in today's society, the idea might fly away. There's too much stimulus, there's too much content, there's too many ideas, there's too much discussion. What I'm saying is write it down. If you write it down, you can come back to it, and it could be the basis of something that really can help your application. If you're making an event, think about that event from the media perspective. How is that event unique? How is that event interesting? Why is it a story? Why do people want to talk about that? And so if you think about what you're doing and you try to look at it from someone else's point of view, how is it unique? If something is unique, then it becomes potentially newsworthy. If it's something that other people have already done, possibly less so. If something is interesting for whatever reason, then it's more likely to get media coverage. Another idea to think about if you're trying to get an O1 visa is to collaborate. I've had plenty of visas where someone wasn't the principal of any activity, but they were a collaborator. And if they get media attention as a collaborator, then that media attention becomes their media. Okay? So one of the things to think about is partner that can help you. If you're a student, I'm not against collaborating with other students. If those students have interesting skills, or they have media content or media contacts, or they have extreme creativity, if it's part of a group, that's great. You can collaborate with that group, but you have to make sure that if you're trying to get media attention from this, that you have some sort of impact and that you control the credits to some extent so that you get the right credit. If you get the wrong credit, if you do something and you're not properly credited, it's not necessarily that helpful for an ON visa application. I'm going to discuss professors for a minute. If people are students or if they're in either undergrad or an MFA program, a lot of times they can do some sort of project with the professor, and the professor who has decades of experience either working on projects or having media contacts, that professor can really do something that can get media attention. And that can be very helpful for a visa application, or it can be something that just doesn't help at all. And one of the things that the people have to think about if they're working with the professor is how are they getting credited, and how is the professor describing that event to the media. If the professor says, I'm working on a project with all of my students, then it's essentially a student project and it's not necessarily something that will be that helpful for a visa application. On the other hand, if someone is a professor and they're doing something that's outside of school, if it's an art exhibition or some sort of like media event or design event that's not school related, just because a person is your professor doesn't mean that he has to characterize that or she has to characterize that as a school event. So there's something that it's worth thinking about and discussing with the professor in terms of how they relate it to the media and how a person is credited for this sort of work. Another thing to think about is steering away from professors altogether. Sometimes when people are students or they're just getting started, there can be other influential people that are working on projects, and there are opportunities that either an artist or a designer can get involved with that can really be helpful for their visa application. One of the things that people really have to think about if they're in the United States is whether they're authorized to work or if something is considered like an internship or something is not work at all. And so people have to be a little bit careful. If you're in the United States and you have a student visa and you don't have employment authorization, you're generally not going to be allowed to be paid. You might be allowed to be paid for work on campus, but generally you're not going to be allowed to be paid. There are certain situations where something is not really for payment. If it's something that you work on as an artistic project, that might be something that you are allowed to do, and it could be something that's really, really helpful. So I've had plenty of people over the years that have had student visas or other types of visas, and each time we have to kind of identify what the event is and whether that event is something that will trigger a question from immigration about whether that was employment. Obviously, no one should work if they're not authorized to work. Another thing to think about is press releases and what you are telling the world about your event. There are plenty of websites that will recommend how you write a press release, and there's a lot of articles on that topic as well. Just a few little tips here. I would keep a press release limited to one page. I want you to look for a compelling headline, something that's going to catch the attention of a person who might write a story. You have to get right to the point. You have to tell the media why the story is interesting. It's a good idea to put in some quotes, because quotes, and if you can give the quote, that's really going to be helpful. But the quotes are something that make a press release more juicy and something that's kind of pre-written. One of the things to think about if you're writing a press release is not to focus on the words young or being a student. If it's not a student-related event, you don't really have to mention that in your press release. I mentioned earlier that for the purposes of an ON visa, going viral is often a very good thing. One of the things that people need to think about is they don't want to go viral for the wrong reason. So you've seen plenty of videos where people go viral, and it's not necessarily a good thing. But there can be instances where people go viral for the right reason. So I've had clients that have posted illustrations on Instagram, and they've gone viral. I've had photographers that post on Instagram and other formats, and they've gone viral. They've gotten a lot of followers, and from that, they either got media exposure, or they've actually gotten clients, or they've gotten book deals. And so it's not the actual going viral that is something that that will be essential to the visa application. It's what comes from that. Once someone goes viral and a lot of people know about that person, there can be other opportunities, and from those opportunities, we can potentially have the basis of a visa application. Another thing to remember is where you are from. So sometimes I advise my clients to speak to the media in their home country. If you pitch a story at a magazine or a newspaper in your country, the perspective from that person is that this is something that happened in the United States, and it's something that could be very interesting in that country, even though in the United States it's something that isn't a story. So one of the things to think about is use all of your media contacts, including media contacts with people outside of the United States, because if you get an important newspaper or magazine in your country to cover something, then it's going to be really helpful. You should remember that newspapers, even major newspapers, have to come out every day, and they need something to write about. So if you have a press release or a media content and you have a story that is compelling and clear, you can find yourself with media attention in your country or in another source that can be very much the cornerstone of a visa application. It's not necessarily always the case where one event and one article can be enough to get a visa, but that can be kind of the backbone of a case. And then if you have supporting media in lesser magazines, or you have additional events where you're not necessarily the lead, they can kind of supplement that major event. And so think about that when you are trying to be out in the world, and just seek that attention and see what you can get.